Bilawal, thank you so much for joining me today. Super excited to chat with you. And Bilawal, I was trying to kind of sum up, everything that you do. And here's my go at it. So you're a former product manager at Google. You've just left, last week. So congrats on that. You were there for nearly 6 years. You have a YouTube channel called Billy FX with nearly, I think, 400,000 subs. You have a TikTok with 1 million followers, also Billy FX. You have an awesome newsletter called the Creative Tech Digest. And you recently started a awesome podcast called the Creative Technology Podcast. So I was thinking, okay, how can I describe like what you do? And what I came up with was teacher, student, and creative on the forefront of the metaverse. How is that?
I love that. Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. Perfect. Amazing. Awesome, man. Well, I'd love to hear more about your background because it seems like you've been obviously up to some really, really incredible stuff. So tell me all about like maybe even pre-Google.
The abridged version is, I'm a creative technologist, product builder, and a content creator. And grew up across India, the UK, and the US, a little bit of a global upbringing. And the computer graphics bug bit me early, man. So 12-year-old, I got into visual effects, self-taught myself 3ds Max, Maya, all these fun tools, After Effects. And that sort of started this theme in my life, blending the physical and digital world, or the creative version of that, blending reality and imagination. Ended up studying computer science and business at the University of Southern California, right as like mobile boom was happening. So all of my background in VFX and 3D got channeled into product design. And then I basically spent a decade in tech, almost exclusively across AR, VR, and 3D mapping. I was like a lame-o Google Glass Explorer back in 2013. So back in the early days of AR, done everything from enterprise AR to consumer AR, VR, and of course, both enterprise and consumer 3D mapping technologies. Along the way, I've been flexing my creative muscles, hence the YouTube and TikTok, and really started taking that stuff seriously around the pandemic when I didn't have to sit in this like godforsaken bus from San Francisco to Mountain View. And here we are today, generative AI blowing up, creative technology is at the forefront, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be a part of it. That's
amazing. All right, so creative technology, what is that? Because it's so hard to, in my mind, define what's going on now. And shortly after this, I'm going to ask you, what is the metaverse, which is even harder. But what is creative technology? It's happening now, but I can't say it in like a simplistic way.
It's hard, right? Like I would say it's like the art and science of visual effects and 3D animation and augmented reality. Any place where you're using, technological building blocks in service of a story or an experience or even a creation tool itself, right? So I think it has an impact on both the creation and the consumption side, how you create content and then how you engage and consume with content, either in a passive fashion or in an active fashion, which is perhaps of interest to you and your audience with things like, in quotes, the metaverse, right? So I think of creative technology as like this like nexus of a bunch of these disciplines. And the expertise around it has been sort of littered across, a bunch of different verticals, right? You've got computer vision aspects to it. You've got computer graphics aspects to it. You've obviously got the traditional art and storytelling aspect to it. And you sort of bring it all together. The banner term I like is creative technology.
Love it. All right. So metaverse. What is the metaverse? How do you define it? How do you describe it? I feel like I've changed my definition of it a million different times. So yeah, I want to hear from you. What is it?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Let me pull out the Matthew Ball 17-point definition. Just kidding. No. Love Matthew's writings though. I would say the metaverse to me is basically a spatial embodiment of the internet we all know and love. One that isn't a bunch of two-dimensional document object models, like basically a bunch of docs interconnected together with hyperlinks. And really Web 2.0 is still that. Maybe we got some like fancier user experience on mobile and web. But to metaverse to me starts mirroring the physical world as you and I know it, right? And we embody ourselves in it in a more intuitive way. Our identity, the spaces and places we care about, the experiences we care about. Critically, it's not just an escapist fantasy. I think that's a piece of it. You can have two modes. There's the get rid of everything and like pull me away from reality, not be constrained by it. But on the other hand, layering the internet on top of the real world, connecting bits and atoms, if you will, is equally a part of this like rather lofty concept. And then AR, VR devices to me are a more spatial first way to engage with the internet. It's not required. You can use the metaverse on a 2D device, but certainly it's far more intuitive on a 3D spatial device versus, your 2DOF mouse and a 2D screen. So will it be centralized, decentralized, some hybrid? I think that's all orthogonal. But at the end of the day, it's a more spatial, more intuitive, more human-centric version of the internet.
And why do you think that the term metaverse, went from like people almost didn't really care about it, and then now it's almost like cringy? So why is that?
Yeah, it did have like a moment under the sun last year, and it was like all everyone could talk about. And then, it sort of petered out. And actually the year before, right? 2021 is really when the hype started. I think we're seeing hype cycles get compressed more and more. We're in the midst of the next hype cycle, which is obviously generative AI right now. I think what happened is VR, AR started off ostensibly in 2013 with the glass stuff, and then 2014 with Oculus and the acquisition. But nobody really knew where that was headed, right? And then the metaverse, I think in 2021 presented perhaps a lofty, but a fairly descriptive depiction of what the future of computing could look like. And so, we as humans, and I think certainly industry professionals and VCs are always looking for the next trend to invest in, the next wave to ride. And the metaverse sort of seemed to be that, right? Like install base of hardware devices were going up. We had a massive, pandemic. And as a consequence of that, all these trends got accelerated, remote work, Zoom, all these things that we never thought would happen. And so suddenly everyone who was saying, hey, not AR is the future, suddenly thought VR is. And then the perfect encapsulation of sort of this dimensional 3D interactive internet became, in quotes, the metaverse. What was most interesting to me, though, Andrew, was how every company painted the vision for the metaverse from their own unique perspective. It was interesting to see how Epic was talking about it versus Meta. I mean, they freaking rebranded the whole thing. I wonder how they feel about that rebranding right now. And then even Microsoft with the enterprise metaverse, and Snapchat sort of distancing itself from the term, but still kind of talking about the same things. Maybe just saying AR instead. So now what we're seeing is actually, hardware is hard, atoms are harder than bits, right? And so I think it's going to take a while for these devices to catch on. And I think it's just been subsumed or replaced by generative AI because it's not only here and now, it can kind of permeate and fuse itself into all the devices and services and product experiences we use today. So that's why I think these hype cycles are getting compressed, and maybe that's a little bit of the anxiety everyone feels in the industry. I'm curious, what's your take on the boom and the bust of the metaverse, if you will?
I think that you're right about the hype cycles being condensed. And, we had Web3. It's still around, but there was obviously a crazy hype cycle in 21 for anything crypto Web3.
100%,
and
yeah.
If the issue with a lot of, I don't know, society, whatever you want to call it today, where if it's not impacting your life right now, then it's kind of people are okay, what else is there, right? In my mind, Web3 has always been a multi-decade play. Metaverse, same thing. It's a multi-decade play evolution. But AI, I mean, that blew everyone away because it was applicable right now. It wasn't hey guys, multi-decade, it's going to change blah, 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 X, Y, Z. Yeah. It's no. You can use it right now here, generate images, generate text, generate audio, whatever. And that, I think, has blown a lot of people away, including myself. I mean, the pace of that innovation has just been incredible. So I get why people are, if you're talking about this new technology, they want it now versus hey, don't tell me it's going to be 10 years from now, right? So I get that. Well, I want to dive really deep with you in AI in a bit, but building off that, how are you thinking the metaverse, quote unquote, is going to evolve going forward? Are we just going to one day, Apple's going to release their AR glasses and then suddenly, we're going to walk around and we're going to see augmented reality, and that's more, the metaverse is evolving there. We're going to have better VR. How is this metaverse going to evolve? Because I know we're in it now, hence why, we've been talking remotely on video and
That's
audio.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, just tell me about that evolution.
It's a great question. It's hard to predict these things, but given that a lot of the metaverse adoption is hinged on devices, I do agree with you that a mainstream moment like an Apple XR AR headset would certainly boost things. Google and Samsung announced a partnership on similar lines about a month ago. And so suddenly, headsets were in vogue, and then it was basically Meta sort of carrying and seeding the install base. And hats off to Zuck and Meta for doing that. I think it needs to be more mainstream than that, right? As on the consumption, like the device side, the interaction device side. I think there's also a lot of hard technical problems to solve, right? Like in our async conversation, we talked about like you alluded to storage and compute, right? Like certainly that's a huge piece of it. Before this conversation, we were talking about, oh yeah, like the recording may get laggy, but like Riverside's recording this stuff locally. When we're talking about like massively co-present, persistent virtual worlds, we need to figure out how to make that stuff happen, right? Like obviously sharding is a solution to some of that, but that's not really like hey, I'm going to go to virtual Coachella with like 10,000 people and just go vibe with people. It's more like here's like a bunch of small chat rooms where you can have some fun and like VR chat or whatever, or even Fortnite, right? Like what I think is going to happen is it's going to be like clearly AI has sort of taken the attention of all the large players. And I would say a lot of the venture, like the investment in the space too. So I think that's going to slow down the metaverse in quotes a little bit. At the same time, I think generative AI is going to be so crucial to populating the metaverse, right? Like whether that was Web3, whether that was like, the centralized or decentralized version of the metaverse, everyone talked about like the barrier to create 3D content is so high. Like I grew up learning these like esoteric tools like Autodesk Maya. There's like, 30-year-old code bases and all this crap that you have to learn just to make 3D stuff. And luckily apps like TikTok have made that easier for video, and that hasn't quite happened for 3D. So I'm almost hoping generative AI, like now that it's being like pulled to the center of attention for investment, is going to actually seed a bunch of the technology we need to populate these metaverses. And I do think it's plural, by the way. Hence the internet, interconnected internet. Maybe you could call that the metaverse in singular. That becomes so many philosophical debates to be had. But regardless, content problem will get solved. And then what we'll see is like very like incremental use cases sort of layering on top of each other. Obviously, I'm biased. Like I worked on a bunch of the augmented reality, the world scale AR stuff. So I think like that's going to be a fundamental building block. Like, we launched the geospatial API that lets you like attach 3D content to the world in 100 countries. That's the most ubiquitous 3D canvas out there, available to developers at no cost. Yes, it's mobile AR now, and like, Lime, micromobility companies like Lime or Bird are using it to make parking easier and like keep streets clean. And Gorillas is using it to stage like a concert in Times Square. But where I think this is all going to go is like when headsets come online and glasses come online, all of this platform is slowly being seeded by a bunch of different players and a bunch of different companies. And so we'll see layer by layer these capabilities stack on top of each other until one day you and I are in like a fully virtual embodied experience. We've got our like codec avatars and like, we're live streaming this with multi-camera edits and all of that. So I think it's going to take a while to get there. And maybe the last piece I'll say that is really missing in all of this is interoperability. Maybe you relate to this given your background, is like, not only do we have esoteric tools that make it hard to create content, making sure these content can jump between experiences, not just the assets themselves, but when you attach interactivity to them, how do you take that whole like scene graph and have it translate to a completely different world with different rules? There's so much thinking that needs to happen that I just think it'll take time. It'll be step by step.
Do you think the internet has made the world a better place?
I think it's always good and bad. Technology to me is always the ultimate double-edged sword. And I particularly feel that way about the internet and social media. I think it's like, in one way, I don't think the AI revolution we're talking about right now could have happened without it. The internet gave an opportunity for humans across the world to connect. And Web 2 sort of democratized text and photo, kind of. And so we started creating these digital twins of our societies effectively online, right? Like with the internet. So I think like, gosh, in terms of democratization of information, wow, like the potential has been phenomenal. It like gives me tingles just thinking about sort of this like hive mind entity that we're all sort of like contributing to. On the other hand, it is an apparatus of immense amount of control and influence. And control and influence both in a centralized sense, like sort of the hub and spoke model, if you will, but also in terms of like, Snowden revelations, Prism, all that stuff. This is right around when I was like graduating college when this stuff happened, 2012, actually, I think is when Snowden happened. And it was just like, the tip of the iceberg, right? But on the other hand, it's also at the edges of these nodes, right? You can have bad actors co-opt, algorithms that put content out there, such as, a social media platform. I'm not going to single any one of them out because it's not their fault, but it can become this method of, spreading vast amounts of disinformation. And so I think it's good and bad, and it's always going to be like that. And you layer in AI on top of that, holy hell, it is like you just turn that up to 11, the upside and the downside.
Okay, so expanding off that, will the metaverse be a force for good in the world, right? Or will it be any different than the internet?
It has the opportunity to be two kind of futures. And I'll paint the extremes because I think always the answer is in the balance. And that'll be sort of, you'll notice a theme in all my answers in this conversation is going to be about like walking the line that is like, sharper than the edge of a sword. So the two extremes to me are like, let's just take VR and AR as like guinea pigs of the extremes. VR, you could have like the Cartman episode of like, I'm playing World of Warcraft and my mommy's like coming and giving me like Hot Pockets and like swapping out my like poop tray. And, you're just getting like Mountain Dew straight to the vein and you're just consuming content all day, every day. The Wall-E dystopian future, if you will. That's one extreme. On the other extreme, it's like, we're deeply connected to like the world around us. It's all augmented reality, but we've all sort of like succumbed to this like, system, like, think of it like the Brave New World on steroids, if you will. It's like this sort of dystopian utopia. And so like I think of those two worlds, like one where we're deeply connected to the world and then one where we're sort of deeply disconnected from the world. And I hope the metaverse kind of affords a path somewhere in the middle where it's just far more intuitive. Like ostensibly when I look at my cousins who are Gen Z, they're already like sucked into their goddamn devices. And I totally sound like a millennial with back pain saying this, but like, like the metaverse is here now. You alluded to this is the 2.5D metaverse that we're sort of perhaps engaging in right now. So I think the answer is going to be in the balance and it can like amplify the good and the bad. I certainly think there's a ton of potential for it to be less taxing on us than looking at these like slabs of glass on our phone. But at the same time, I do worry about what happens when we sort of jack into the matrix, so to speak. Like we're genuinely laying the substrate for the matrix, right? And so like, I hope we don't end up powering, ending up being batteries for machines. Obviously that's like science fiction and out there. But at the same time, I hope we're not just like totally inundated by advertising too, right? Like you wake up one day and you're like, I just feel this like immense thirst for Bud Light. Let me go get some Bud Light. I wonder what happened there. Like, so that's how I think about these technologies. It's about how we wield them as users of the technology, and then how like product builders and platforms and even governments that are increasingly going to have a crucial role to play in this, like set the right incentives in place for the ecosystem.
All right. So you mentioned like jacked in the matrix, and I have to ask you now, brain machine interfaces. So, today we have technology that you can control computers with there's a wristband that Control Labs, they created it, and you can control it with your thoughts, a small game and your mouse and whatnot. It was purchased by Meta back a few years back. You can paralyze people, have the ability to restore some movement again. Blind people can actually have some, not vision restored, but it's like they can see outlines and stuff. So they can see, it's all kind of black and dark, but they can still see outlines. So they can partial restored vision. You can activate your taste of sense, or sorry, your sense of taste. You can do all these things, smell, obviously, of course. These things are all possible today. Mainly they're being used on people that have, disabilities or or in some sort of accidents to restore those functions. But it's all doable right now, right? This is not like sci-fi. This is like today. And so you extrapolate that out. And with, you have kernel, you have Neuralink, et cetera. I'm more excited about like non-invasive BMIs versus like invasive. Invasive kind of is like very scary. Where do you think that we're headed on that front? Like, I just can't imagine that, if you could, put on your non-invasive BMI and go hike, climb Mount Everest from the comfort of your office, and your brain actually thinks it's there, and you're, experiencing the wind and the smell or whatever, you experience that. I can't imagine that we're not going to go there. I know this is like getting really sci-fi, but I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll put the complete speculation hat on for this one. Like, and I think it's not just sci-fi. I think it's also like, it's been in these like spiritual and esoteric, traditions that have been around for thousands of years too, right? Like, the concept of Maya and Prakriti in Vedic philosophy, for example, South Asian philosophy. Or, Elon pontificates about this too. Is like, are we in the base layer of the simulation? Given that we can layer these capabilities, as you're alluding to sort of replicate everything we have as this like sort of sensory experience, let's say there's something like consciousness, and then we're in this like meat bag that's sort of like our sensing apparatus, and we're engaging with the environment around us. We really don't know like what is outside of our body. We have even from a reductionist science perspective, we have no way of knowing what is outside of us unless we can slice, dice, and do repeatable experiments around it, right? And then you throw in stuff like quantum, and we're just like grasping at straws, and string theory, and it just goes off the rails, even in like, the scientific community. So in those situations, I just go back to like, what have like ancient traditions been saying about this stuff too? And it mirrors a lot of that. Matrix, of course, was inspired by a bunch of that philosophy and stuff like that too, right? So where do I think we're going with BCIs? Like, on one hand, they're a really intuitive way of interfacing with technology. I mean, I don't think the be all and end all of spatial computing devices is taking a frickin' screen and putting it like a couple of inches away from our eyeballs. That seems kind of lame. And of course, you've got all these like, light field displays and all that type of stuff, and they're projecting photons into your eyes. That could maybe make sense. But then you go to the multi-sensory aspect, right? Like, a lot of the ways we make memories is like, and the way we tether ourselves to experiences in the real world is multi-sensory in nature, right? And so I think it's interesting to think about the fact that we can dream. Some people can lucid dream and control that stuff. You've got like, shamans and gurus that are able to like really control things like parasympathetic functions that we think are not controllable, but you can control them. So it wouldn't surprise me that we come up with technology that can kind of do that in a more predictable way. Like, why do you need Unreal Engine when our mind has like Unreal Engine plus running and, creating photorealistic dreams that are like often indistinguishable from reality? And how do you figure out you're in a dream? Well, you look at your phone and the text looks garbled up. And so funnily enough, there's like this interesting, weird, unscientific analogy to like the current state of diffusion models where like text and all this stuff looks kind of wrangly, but you can still, just from this amalgamation of sensor input, you can conjure a pretty realistic world. So I think these more intuitive forms of perhaps, leaning into computing capabilities that we have in our brain to, create more predictable and controlled experiences is super exciting. I'm sure that's a direction we go in. And I, like you, am equally stoked on non-invasive procedures to go about doing that. Yeah, it's just like a higher bandwidth way of interfacing with technology, right? So I think that's an inevitability. Again, I'd give the caveat of like immense upside, immense downside. Oh yeah, like, do you really want, your thoughts being indexed and centralized, even at the edge? What are we gonna do with that data? There's clearly some really dystopian monetization opportunities there, but also very utopian applications, which is why you see, people who have sensory impairments being the first in line to benefit from this technology.
Totally. Okay. I'm going to bring it a little bit, back to less sci-fi, even though it's still pretty magical. But all right, so what does the future of entertainment look like? Just because I feel like, we have Midjourney, we have Stable Diffusion, we have all these different tools now where people are creating incredible art and stories and text and audio and video is not quite there yet. I mean, I've seen some like very early demos and they're like pretty janky, but also like Midjourney 1 was like a little bit janky like that. Now it's absolutely incredible. It's been 2 years, or maybe less, I forget. But
less, yeah.
So yeah, like, what is entertainment going to look like with these tools coming out where you can literally generate a insanely cool scene, movie, story, whatever, instantly?
This is the $1 trillion question, I think, and a lot of people are going to figure it out. I'll answer this in a couple ways. The first is to say that what I know is going to happen. The traditional studio model, it's donezo.
When you say traditional studio, can you describe that? Like, what is that?
Yes. So this trend that we're currently on, I would say we're in the middle of the trend, which is thus far how entertainment has been made is, a small number of studios create one size fits all content, right? Like small number of studios were able to centralize around this like patch of land called Hollywood. They were able to raise money, be this sort of gravity well for talent, whatnot, and end up creating movies that are designed for mass appeal, right? Sure, you've got like the tentpole productions and like, then the scary movie 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kind of franchise going on too. But essentially it's content that's designed to be one size fits all. I think YouTube was the next step on that trajectory, which said, all right, now we'll have like, not everyone's a creator, and creation still takes effort. We're going to have like 1% of our total users are actually going to materially create content, and they'll come up with stuff that would never get greenlit by, studio. by like the formal studio world. And so like, that was awesome. So we saw like an explosion of content formats, creators that we never thought we'd see. Mr. Beast perhaps being like, an exemplification of that. So already we're from a world where like people knew Tom Cruise, the guy, the Himothy, as Gen Z likes to say. And now it's like Mr. Beast. And what is Mr. Beast? He's like the exemplification of what you can do on YouTube. You can build content. He's got a chocolate brand. He's got doing like cloud kitchens, on and on and on, right? Frickin' you've got, Logan Paul and KSI. Hey, we've got reach across geographies. Let's aggregate that stuff and, essentially go take on PepsiCo and Gatorade. So you're already at a world where like the Tom Cruises of the world historically never, that were essentially a byproduct of the studio model that I just described. We're now transforming to this like sort of creator, business entrepreneur, creatorpreneur model where, they're in charge of their own content. They're building their own audiences and then they're creating products and services around that. Enter the TikTok era. Further democratized. Okay, so it's not just 1% of people that are creating content, 30, 40, 50% of the user base of TikTok and now YouTube Reel or YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels are able to create. Because the barrier to creation keeps going lower and lower, right? Like you don't need like Premiere and frickin', we were talking about DSLRs before this and SD cards and all this crap. I just use my phone. It's like studio in a box, studio in my pocket. I can do cool stuff with it. So that's creating another the Addison Rays, like another like sort of like the Sway houses, like another line of content creators are emerging. I think AI is like going to just make all that stuff look like a frickin' footnote. So I think we're on the precipice of like massive disruption where you can totally have one size fits all content to now more and more personalized content. And even the feed model, that was the big change too, right? Like instead of this like social graph based discovery mechanism, now it's interest graph based, right? Like Netflix has perhaps been doing this in their own intuitive way. We've got this library of content. They're using analytics from their audience that's watching the content to figure out what to make. It's no longer this like, kind of old school, let's go focus group, what we're going to do. But I really believe in so-and-so actor. Let's push this actor. It's far more data oriented. The thumbnails to get you to click on stuff change based on your preferences. And then YouTube and TikTok is that on steroids, perhaps on the more like totally democratized end. When I think about AI in the context of all of this, I don't think that trend of personalization is going to go away. Now, what's hard to predict, this is maybe what I'll end on, is how personalized is it going to be? Is there going to be this like innate nature in us as humans? Like since time immemorial, we sit around the fire and we tell each other these stories. And, we're talking about, spiritual traditions, whether it's like the Abrahamic or Vedic traditions or the Eastern traditions, the themes remain the same, right? So the hero's journey, as people call it. There is this like sort of need in us to like encode sort of almost like generational knowledge, which almost points to one size fits all kind of narratives. Maybe they get like sort of tailored to specific context or whatnot. So I ask myself, are we going to have like tentpole productions like the Marvel Cinematic Universes of the world? Or are we going to have just like, it's not even like, it's just like the TikTok feed making content for you, Andrew, at the edge to your needs and based on your freaking biometric feedback. And like, you talk about Mr. Beast retention editing. Now you're doing retention editing at the edge to keep you engaged. So it's like this spectrum of tentpole content, one size fits all, to totally disposable content that's made for the context, need, moments at hand. Is it going to be all of the above? Probably. I think realistically it'll be sort of a portfolio, but that's sort of how I think about the future of entertainment. Some interesting things there that can happen in terms of use cases to make it more concrete, perhaps in the near term, would be, I'm convinced in about a year's time, you'll be watching Netflix and like you and your partner could be like, I want to see myself like we're going to be in this movie, pay like $14.99 and you sort of like reskin yourselves to be sort of the leading roles. To take that a step further, like what are movies that would never get made? Are creators going to be wielding this, or is it going to be like, like maybe me sitting down with my family and saying, hey, I want to watch Spider-Man set in Mumbai directed by J.J. Abrams. And you can just like conjure up the movie on demand, down to the TikTok feed example that I gave you in the long term, which could get really dystopian too. So that's how I think about the future of entertainment. I think there's many interesting manifestations and directions it could go. And I think it'll apply across modalities from audio, obviously, to like, kind of consumption content like books and blogs. down to obviously photo, video, 3D interactive experiences.
It's just a mind-boggling kind of future we have, coming.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like it's like,
and apologies, that was a lot.
Yeah. No, it was insane and incredible. So I guess like in that future, will human creators still be relevant? Because if I can just copy paste you and make an AI generated you and have the content be something similar to what you would say and maybe what you believe, then it's like, first of all, yeah, what happens to the people creators? And then number two is, does it concern you that this world that we're heading towards is like personalized? Because sure, like TikTok is showing me what I like and I like it, I enjoy it, obviously, but maybe they're going to start serving me some content that I don't necessarily enjoy, but they're like, hey, I want to just kind of sway Andrew a little bit. I want to try to say, hey, I don't know, plastic water bottles or whatever are like bad for you, right? Like buy this metal one or who knows what.
Right.
So yeah, well, what are your thoughts on like humans in this future as creators, and then creators, entertainers, and then the personalization?
I think they're both really good questions. I think the human creator one is a choice we have to make as an industry, both creators and consumers and advertisers. I think we all have to make this decision. I think there is totally a dystopian future where like content creators are basically providing reinforcement learning to like replace themselves. So just like, I always found it a little heart-wrenching when I'd see like an Uber or Lyft driver and they had like a little smartphone running up there being like, oh yeah, Uber just pays me to like, record my stuff. They're using it for their self-driving thing. And I'm like, yo, you're literally like subsidizing the thing that's going to replace you. And I think in a similar fashion as like, especially these new generation of tools pop up, I don't think Adobe's too entrenched in like caring about the creator to do this. But I think other creation tool companies that are completely cloud-based could totally start mining insights from content creators that use their tools in the near term to make original content and then replace them completely. And of course, to your point, the deepfakes thing, like the virtual influencers, the Lil Michaelas on steroids, the virtual YouTuber thing in Japan, which has been a massive trend since like 2016 on steroids too, could like go in a very dystopian direction, right? Like, why deal with the Jared Subway incident, when you could just have like literally an influencer you could puppeteer to your heart's content? I could see brands and businesses salivating over that. I could see even Hollywood execs salivating over that, right? Like, Hollywood loves to make little like, not everyone, I should be, but the trope is Hollywood loves to make like little statues and, like little trophies out of talent, right? Oh, now you don't even have to worry about it. You can make as many trophies on demand. Oh, you want to bring like, Marilyn Monroe back from the dead? Awesome. Do it. Bruce Willis just digitized his own likeness, right? Like, it's going to become harder for him to make movies. Maybe we could see Die Hard 15 or whatever. So I think like that's a decision we need to make where we make sure that the creator is at the heart of this experience. And the reason I say that is like self-expression, creative self-expression, if that is such a like key part of us as humans, that it would be a shame to outsource that completely. On the other hand, I believe far more in this like co-pilot creation experience, like the amplification of it, if you will. Let's keep the creators at the center because there is some like X factor in us, yes, that's hard to just replicate with large statistical models. Maybe we'll get there, I don't know. But still, I think there's some X factor in good taste and sort of like the artist, the heart and soul of the artist, if you will. It's a very like, kind of soft, mushy topic, but, I think that's a decision, all this to say.
But don't you think market forces will compel everyone to utilize these tools versus? I agree with you. Like, I think, I would love a future where humans are still creating content and interacting and whatnot. But I'm just like, man, markets are like the most powerful forces in the world. And if you can save, millions and billions of dollars perhaps by utilizing AI instead of people to create content, then it's like, that's probably what's going to end up happening.
I think maybe there's a timeline that absolutely happens, and the profits are just too hard to ignore. Why pay? We're already seeing this trend where like, creators like me, brands love us because, hey, why should I pay an agency that comes up with a frickin' slide deck and a bunch of crap? Again, no offense to the agency world. Why would a brand work with an agency that brings like all this overhead to the party with slide decks and I got a producer and like, creative director? Whereas like, hey, we'll give you the content and we bring an audience to the party, right? you take that to the extreme and you could have like MCNs of just like completely virtual influencers that could like programmatically be bidded for at like, you can optimize the crap out of this sort of marketplace. And yeah, like I think the financial upside of that is going to be immense. And maybe that is going to be sort of like this dystopian Black Mirror, Ready Player One type future. I still think the countervailing influence to all of that is mediums themselves are not going to remain static. What I mean by that is right now, like a lot of backlash you see from artists, which by the way, I have a hard time, like I empathize with it, but I like kind of want them to see things my way. Cause like I grew up learning these like esoteric tools, spending decades learning this crap, like reading thick books with a freaking CD-ROMs at the end of it. But I don't view it as like, oh crap, my craft is gone and replaced. And I think the negative response happens when you think of it in zero sums in terms of the mediums. I think humans are always very good at conjuring up the next more complex medium that we couldn't possibly have created for if not for these automation capabilities, these acceleration capabilities. And maybe to our initial conversation, that's the metaverse, right? Like, and so if we want to create compelling content in the metaverse, you still need like a human in the loop, right? Maybe that's the version of like Neo in the most recent Matrix, right? Where he's like this game designer, like savant kind of game designer. I think maybe we'll see something like that where like you'll still need the James Camerons of the world, like sort of these visionaries who can almost like, the Beethovens of the world, to use an old example, that can sort of orchestrate a vast amount of like automated agents that help you conjure up content for this far more complex medium. And I think like people get bored of mediums easily, like even podcasts sort of reinvented radio, if you will. And so like once that reinvention happens, you'll kind of want that X factor, the thing that like makes you feel like you're alive. And so I think that's the countervailing influence. And again, like most things, maybe those worlds will live in parallel, right? Like, could this end up in a place where most things are mass produced consumer product goods that are boxed and, sit on shelves for a long time, but also you have Whole Foods and everyone wants to go buy organic. So that's kind of how I think about how the economics may play out. I sure hope it's like a hybrid. Certainly, I think, I'm not as naive to think it'll be this like solar punk utopia either. It never is.
Someone recently told me, because I was saying, I was like, I don't know how people are going to compete in this world. And someone was like, well, there's always the market for your Whole Foods example, always a market for like the handcrafted, human made. They took their time and they put their love and energy into whatever that is. Like, Japan's a great example. They have always incredible, whether it be like a dish or whether it be like handmade sea salt or like, the Wagyu, they massage cows and whatever. Like, so there'll always be a market for that. And yeah, I guess I'm proving my own point wrong, but I just wanted to ask you to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. The other question you had was personalization. Was that?
Personalization.
Yeah. I think the personalization one kind of feeds into this point, right? Like the sort of autonomous influencer agents paid for by the highest corporate entity to influence people in the wild is one extreme of that personalization. Again, like I don't think algorithms and machines are inherently good or evil. I legitimately think it's like nuclear. And I say nuclear because I think the stakes are as high as nuclear. It's just like, there's the overt explosion and the ramifications of that. Here it's not as overt, but it's certainly the shockwave permeates through us as humans and leaves as much of a devastating outcome, right? Like even in the Instagram era, like people talk about like the social media, the social graph era, that was kind of personalization. And people talked about, like what is, again, going back to like spiritual traditions, like every religion or spiritual faith talks about envy. Well, how do you like induce envy in people? Yeah, just show them everything your neighbor has or your friend's friend has, or that influencer you don't kind of know, but you're still like, oh my God, this person has a freaking boat. Like I'm out here with my Beamer 3 Series. This is so lame. And so like this ability to peer into the glass house, a perfectly curated glass house of everyone else, I think wasn't good for mental health, especially of the younger generation. That's the thing I worry about the most, not to sound like a boomer millennial, but like, I'm so glad I remember life before like technology and I could go out biking with my friends and like my parents had no way to reach me and stuff like that. And so I think like even the social graph based personalization, like the era that I kind of grew up with and that you kind of grew up with had its downsides. Similarly, the interest-based graph had its pros and cons, right? Like on the plus side, it connected you to your friends, and like I was able to connect with long lost friends from India, from the UK, from like stay in touch, go played like Call of Duty with all my homies from Portland. It was wild, like all the good stuff too. Similar thing with interest-based graph, like all the TikTok feed, if you will. That's where I think it gets a little bit more insidious to your, I think, which is the heart of your question, or when you alluded to like, can you ever so slightly like push the scale in the favor of like getting Andrew to get paranoid about plastics and BPA or whatever and buy the, I don't know, the perfect bronze insert? You know, what's that thing, Kangen water, like the MLM where everyone's like, yeah, ionized water is the thing. You just need, this social media gets co-opted by forces to do that. And certainly it could be when you're sort of outsourcing your faculties or your internal discriminator for what content you want to see to an algorithm, I think it can again be good or bad. So YouTube, I kind of love YouTube because I choose what to click on next. It's not this like, let me give you that Mountain Dew straight to the vein type experience. Now, TikTok is addictive. I love it. You know, I have it on a separate burner phone now, which I don't know what that tells you about me, but like, you know, it's equally addictive. And now you have those same algorithms in YouTube and, you know, Instagram and all that. And so I think I can't do that for more than like 30 minutes without just feeling like my brain is fried. And when you outsource your like discriminator to a feed, I think you're far more susceptible for whether that's a nation state, whether that's a large corporate entity, or a bunch of like the highest paying bidder that's using advertising platforms to reach you to subtly influence you. And so add in like frickin' eye gaze detection, like, and all this other stuff. I mean, I've got a Quest 2 here, or a Quest Pro here, barely used it. But, you know, as a product manager, I noticed the in-app consent I had to click on for Meta to like just use eye tracking. And you take that on steroids, and like Meta, I think is like, you know, it's a company that's in good and bad stuff, just like every other company. But there may be like even less, you know, discriminating companies out there that may be willing to do all sorts of crazy stuff with that type of biometric feedback loop that you end up creating that'll make these algorithms better. And at some point, they know you better than you know yourself. And so good and bad outcomes there. I think personalization isn't going to go away. It's the question of like, can we almost like, and this is maybe perhaps at the heart of this like AI debate that's happening, like where the Gary Marcuses of the world are saying, hey, yo, let's pump the brakes, homie. Like, this is getting a little crazy. Let's not just deploy this out in the wild, because even without all this like super powerful generative stuff, just like, you know, the first iteration of ML based systems that are really good, or even like classical AI systems that were really good at targeting, have been used to both prop up small to medium enterprises and at the same time been used to like, you know, influence democratic elections. I think both can happen, and Gen AI is going to be that on steroids.
All right. So what are your thoughts on, and not to like, you know, harp on like bad things, because the personalization thing that kind of scares me, just because I'm always thinking about edge and advantage, just because obviously, like, you know, we invest in this space and invest in the metaverse. And I'm thinking about who has an advantage in a world where things can be generated so quickly and easily, like nearly for free. And then on the personalization front, I'm like, man, well, if you're not like in cahoots with the algo or really understand the algo, then maybe people won't even be able to see your content. Therefore, how do you get that advantage? Versus like you were mentioning YouTube, like, hey, if I'm a fan of, I don't know, Roman history, I can type in Roman history, look at all the videos, and I click that. When I'm on Reels, I'm just kind of like swiping, and, you know, maybe it'll show Roman history, maybe it won't. So yeah, I guess like, how do you think about advantage or edge in a world where AI can generate things for nearly free? And we have personalization. Actually, let's just do the AI nearly free, because I think personalization is separate.
It is also another $1 trillion questions, right? Like, I have a buddy who's in this past batch of YC doing an AI startup, and he was talking about how vast majority of companies are essentially wrappers around OpenAI stuff, right? And, you know, they're building all this stuff around GPT-3, GPT-4 comes out and takes a bunch of like, you know, the capabilities that they were building around GPT-3 and makes it a part of like the foundational model, right? Like, I think the example that went the most viral online was essentially the myriad of startups that were doing, hey, provide me a mock-up or a 2D sketch, I think, as you alluded to. And then, hey, you get out like, you know, real code. Here's a web app. Here's a native app. Boom, done. I think it's a really interesting question. No one really knows. I think there's some intuition that like, there's one, you know, perhaps, again, I like to think in extremes. There's one extreme, which is like, hey, if you don't make money in the next 2 years, you're absolutely screwed. Like, that's it. Like they're 16 to 24 months. Go out there, figure something out, build a boat. First off, get on a boat, right? Like they say, rising tides lift all boats. So first off, don't drown, get on a goddamn boat. Now, whether that's a tanker ship, like these massive foundational models, or a bunch of these pirate ships that are constantly going to have a pivot party every 2 to 3 months, or like a speedboat, or like a cruise boat, like, OpenAI perhaps, that's like aligning itself with a bigger tanker. I don't know what the answer is. I do know that like there's something interesting about this like notion of reinforcement learning from human feedback. So like, what is Midjourney doing? Like, okay, you've got Stable Diffusion, super open, all the things, the weights are out there, go do stuff. And then you've got like DALL-E, Imogen Party, like the proprietary side of the house. Midjourney's managed to strike this nice balance because they opened their tech up. They got a bunch of people on Discord using it. And the current conviction seems to be in like the AI academic community. There was a really, really good tweet thread on this by Jim from NVIDIA, Jim Fan, research scientist there, which is like the signal for which images Midjourney users were upscaling. Like, how it generates 4 images and you can upscale one, gave them a cue on what was like a good aesthetically pleasing image. And they used that as a feedback loop to make their model better and better and better. So I think there's something very interesting there where like, there's this like massive pre-training step and then this like fine-tuning process, or just like, let's just call it like this process of refining and improving this model, so you could build a moat around having a compelling product user experience where you have an engaged audience or an engaged user base that's helping you solve this like user specific problem. So I think like what it comes down to is like foundational models aren't going to care about all the things unless like frickin' GPT-5 just solves everything for you. Then like RIP, we're all just like, we're returned to paper clips or something. So I don't think that's going to happen. So the place I retreat to on the other end is like, just put on your product management hat, like your product builder hat, and just like solve fucking problems. Solve frickin' problems, like so forget the hype. Forget the AI startup thing, like find a domain that's interesting where there's like a TAM, where there's like a clear ROI and go solve those problems for them. You saw a lot of companies in AR, VR that actually made money, did really boring things like frickin', stock picking inside warehouses, in context medical assistance. Some of the stuff even I worked on back in like my consulting days with Deloitte, like a field service expert on an oil rig with a Google Glass going through a maintenance checklist. You don't need the metaverse to help this person be hands-free and go through something for compliance or safety reasons or give them intelligence at the edge to solve problems. I think like the creator part that you alluded to is also interesting regarding the feed. It's like, and I think maybe that's the part where there's a clearer answer, in my opinion, which is like, Tim Ferriss says this, everyone says this, like, build your goddamn mailing list. There's a reason people say that, right? Like, algorithms at their best are supposed to be reflections of user preferences. But we know there are other forces at play, right? Like, people are talking about TikTok now, and a bunch of people are like, oh my God, like, is the CCP just so subtly putting the scale in favor of like, putting out disinfo and like, of course, the interesting thing there is like, this content is being ostensibly made by Americans or like, Western users, and you just like slightly amplify it. And then you throw in synthetic data and misinformation. Oh my God, I could just like go get depressed about that. But to bring it back, like in this like world where, personalization trend is going to continue. And I think like algorithms are going to get better at showing you what you want. I think people are going to sort of build their own islands of influence, so to speak, right? And that's their mailing list today. And, this may be of interesting to you, given your investing background. I think like Kajabi is doing some version of making that island more interesting. So it's not just like a Substack newsletter. It's like, hey, here's this island that you build, that you own. Like, people know you for it. Like, not just Tim Ferriss's 5 Bullet Friday, but like, you want digital products, you want a community in there, a podcast is integrated into that. So I think like as the incremental cost of creating these type of software experiences go to zero, I think you're going to see more and more creators sort of build their like mini verses. I don't know what the right word is, but like there's sort of islands of influence in this like gigantic metaverse. And yeah, people are going to still want to go to the club, go to Times Square, go to like these public squares where you find new stuff. But hey, like when you're chilling on your Saturday morning, like, walk, which is when I listen to podcasts, I go directly to the people that I like, whose voice and like thoughts I care about, right? Like, or, everyone loves to read instead of the newspaper, which is a sort of an aggregator, their Substack blogs that they like. So I think that trend will continue, and the sophistication with which we can kind of engage in these like smaller islands of influence, maybe Mr. Beast is going to be massive, I don't know, is going to be awesome. And that's how like creators will sort of safeguard themselves from, being purely at the mercy of the in quotes algorithm.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to move a little bit over to a lot of the content you create, especially on Twitter. And it's a lot of like spatial 3D, what we say, like bringing the internet to life, bringing the metaverse to life. Why don't you tell me about that? The 3D scanning of environments, nerfs. I've heard that term and seen that term everywhere. I don't know what it means. So just tell me all about like, what's compelling you to create this awesome content, and how do you do it? And like, what is it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think all the technologies you're listing are going to sort of merge together in this sort of Voltron. That's going to be really interesting for both like how you can make classical content and then just sort of what content turns into. What motivates me is like, honestly, I'll go back to my theme. Like I've since I was a kid, I've been obsessed with, blending the physical and digital world. Like I remember watching like Discovery Kids as a kid, like, oh God, TV. And, there was a show called Mega Movie Magic. And I think they had like this episode on frickin' Independence Day. You've probably seen Independence Day. It's like, the scene where like the frickin' mothership comes down and blows up, There's something more compelling to me about that than like the Pixar stylized animation, just for me as a creator and like a product builder or whatever. And that's because it's like this way of blending, the digital and physical world, or like, maybe the playful version of that is, again, reality and imagination. So all these technologies, photogrammetry, neural radiance fields, which is sort of a new way of doing, in quotes, reality capture. And, now generative AI, which becomes this way to sort of reskin the real world that you capture, almost to the extent where we can now like kit bash reality. Like, kit bashing is like, sort of something that got started even back in the Star Wars days. Like, so back in the day when like, in the first Star Wars, where people are doing like physical motion control. So again, all the stuff we do in Maya and Blender today, they had like freaking robots and like these robots that could do repeatable motions. So you could take like all these like, people, how they build scale models of stuff. They go find all these parts and then they just kit bash that stuff together to give like the Millennium Falcon all this added detail, right? You just find all these parts off like G.I. Joes and like Hot Wheels and whatnot, and you just kind of like mash them all together. Artists have been doing that in the 3D world too, but what's still been hard for us to do has been digitizing reality. This is like, man, like think about 2011. 2011, companies like Apple and Google, massive teams, computer vision experts, massive data centers were required to digitize reality. And so that's like how you got Google Earth. And initially it was 2D, and eventually you could start tilting it and do 3D. And like, it's been, I would say, the adventure of a lifetime for me to work on the remapping the world using all these crazy sensors. But one of the reasons even us at Google, we were able to remap the world easily is because all this technology also democratized drastically. And so what that meant for bigger players like Google is like we could do it at a fidelity that was never seen before. Like, let's literally take like a decade worth of Street View. Let's take a decade worth of aerial imagery and satellite imagery, go collect a bunch of new data at some like remarkable precision. By the way, mind frickin' blowing to just be like, hey, we need to go collect these cities. Can we just like fly some planes and like, oh yeah, can we send some cars with LiDAR and like 150 megapixel sensors and capture this stuff? And we can do that and create this like next gen digital twin. That's what you see in products like Immersive View. But on the other hand of that is also like, how do you keep this model up to date, right? Like, it's like you can remap the world once every couple of years. Maybe you do the major cities once a year. But this democratization also happened, right? So like everyone's been talking about 3D scanning. This sort of started with photogrammetry circa like 2013, 2014 is really when it started becoming more commodity as like CPUs got faster, you got multi-threading, and of course GPUs, right? Like that changed things. So if you remember the first Battlefront, that was like a great example of like Star Wars Battlefront. These artists like went out to the forest, their parking lot, they started using like, again, like sensors got more sophisticated too, like, these full frame cameras we're talking about, they can literally capture 50 megapixel imagery. Let's go capture a bunch of images, and then we can use algorithms to stitch that together into this 3D model. And neural radiance fields are just a more sophisticated way of doing that keeps like the material properties, the vibe of the space and place intact. We can get into the differences if you want, but the meta point is like, reality capture got democratized because sensors got better, compute got cheaper. So now you got like AAA game titles that are like, hey, rather than us having artists build all this crap from scratch, let's go kit bash reality. Let's go capture stuff and like mash that stuff together. And you see amazing artists doing stuff like, in Blender and using reality capture tools to like do the same thing on like an indie budget. And that's really where I got excited too, where my day job was like, yes, let's go use these like massive structured sensor systems and, data center based approaches to remap the world and do awesome things, call that sort of the substrate. But then that has to be anchored with all this interesting content. Some of it's going to be factual. The Matterport realtor tours, that got drastically democratized, right? From like Street View panos to actual like these 3D-ish experiences. And now we're seeing like with neural radiance fields, the next sort of like more immersive iteration of that. And so to me, it's like, a yet another amazing primitive in the creation toolkit where you can digitize reality. You can use it for utilitarian purposes. Or the stuff I've been exploring that you've probably seen on my Twitter is like, I want to reskin reality to look like Minecraft. Actually, I want to channel surf on top of reality. Or, hey, I digitized like my parents' house because they were moving to another place. And like, gosh, we've got so many memories there. Let me just use my like Sony camera and capture it. And then now I can like reskin this place. And so all the like interior design, applications, if you're like building out a new podcast studio and you want ideas to do that, you can do anything from take a single photo to a bunch of photos to a dense amount of photos and get varying levels of ability to model that space and then reskin it. And again, back to utility and tight, like you could even provide that space digitized, to your like, contractor that's going to go redo the place for you. So it can help you across the value chain of creation, whether that's ideation, whether that's like actual like, creation of the content itself. And then like, kind of how you might go and like create experiences in that place itself, right? Like, let me just create like GTA 15 set in like my hometown. Like a kid with a drone and like reality capture and Unreal Engine can go do that already. And people are, right? Like people are using Minecraft and Google Earth to like reinvent like their city inside these worlds. And so generative AI is going to take that stuff to the next level.
So that all sounds freaking awesome. But from I'm thinking about it like in a business lens, like there's been so much progress, right? And I'm like, okay, well, there's been so much progress. There must be a big business use case. So there must be a lot of money in doing that. But it sounds like there's money involved. But the real estate example of seeing the interiors and whatnot, and a few other use cases. But the amount of progress to me seems like, okay, there must be like billions of dollars behind this, right? Is that the case, or is it more like a fun, cool, exciting artistic thing to do versus like, no, this is like you can make a lot of money from this?
I think certainly the players that are making the most money from this are sort of centralized large players. That's where there have been the most obvious use case for this stuff, right? Like maps and a mapping platform, whether that's like first party to get you to your latte or navigate you through your commute or help you figure out which hotel you want to go to. There's obvious applications there. As a part of that value chain, there certainly is place for things like Matterport, but last I checked, their stock ain't doing too hot. On the other hand, I think it's like right now becoming only recently democratized, like ostensibly in the last couple of years, that it's become this primitive and people are figuring out how to compose it. I've actually had a bunch of conversations like, VCs have reached out to me being like, hey, I want to get your thoughts on all the Nerf companies, like all the startups. I would say Luma being perhaps the best, just given their velocity. But, there are others out there too. And I wouldn't discount companies like Polycam. They're doing a great job. They built on Apple's API. So and I think like Apple kind of makes this point too. It's like Apple has Apple Maps. They're clearly using reality capture tech to take that to the next level. They've got their next version of 3D maps. Google got their next version of 3D maps. Microsoft is like also building it, but they're maybe putting in like freaking Microsoft Flight Simulator, but they didn't build it themselves. They work with this company, Black Shark, that's also thinking about how to monetize this. So I think the real money is right now going to the larger players just because of the scale and ubiquity with which they can operate and then connect it to existing ecosystems of both search and discovery and advertising, right? Like I think that's the obvious angle. So these VCs ask me is like, is Nerf going to be the next big thing? And what I say is like, I'm not convinced Nerf is like a business. It feels more like a feature to me. It's a feature that's a part of a bigger product experience. a bigger business ecosystem. And which one is going to be like the biggest one? I don't know. But if you and I believe, we go back to the start of our conversation where the metaverse is connecting the physical and digital world, this is one key piece of it, like a technology that connects those worlds. I think what we're missing is like, to give you an old school example. All right. So like location services and maps happen, right? Google came out with that stuff. And initially it was largely for free, right? Now over time, the price is raised and there's some controversy associated with that. But like, leave that aside, whether you use like OpenStreetMap or Google Maps or whatever, these mapping platforms are there and they make good amount of money. But then you've got Uber that built like a ride sharing, taking those components of like mobile device, GPS sensors on your phone, internet connectivity, ubiquitous map of the world, at least the road networks and the points of interest in it, and then used all of that to create this like, massive business out of it. I think we'll see the same thing happen. I'm not convinced it's as obvious as like digitize, your real estate to start. So who knows what'll happen, but yeah, totally agree with you with your assessment there.
Okay, so before diving deep into AI, I want to ask you, want to clarify, NERF means neural radiance field?
That's exactly right. It's let's do a little primer on NERF if that's helpful.
Yeah.
If you want, yeah. So think of reality capture in three big buckets. There's like visualization, there's analysis, and then there's like machine understanding or localization. Let's break those three buckets down. Visualization is like, I just want this like human readable 3D model of the world, like this pretty model to look at that takes me there, that's transportative, right? And so the techniques to do that have basically been like this thing called photogrammetry, which is the art and science of measuring the world using, imagery observations and other types of sensor data, for example, LiDAR. And what that gives you is this thing called, like there are various data products it produces, but the most well-known one is like just a 3D mesh. Here's a triangulated mesh with textures on it. Now, the cool thing about texture 3D meshes is you've got like this entire ecosystem of like, 3D engines and like, whether that's gaming engines or like all the entertainment stuff like Maya and Max and all Blender we talked about. They know how to work with meshes. But the problem is reality is freaking complex, Andrew, right? Like things are shiny. There's like, your hair is like very like, complex. You've got reflections, you've got refractions, all these like material properties that like really transport you and encapsulate what it means to be at a place is hard to represent with these like meshes. These meshes are very good at representing continuous surfaces, right? So think about OG GTA. It looks like this kind of boxy, clunky thing. Same thing with all this other stuff. If you want to measure the world, like what's the like height of this like doorway and like, do I have enough space in my kitchen to fit this appliance? Yes, you need photogrammetry. On the other hand, you've got this like art and science of something called view synthesis. The problem of view synthesis in computer vision is basically given a bag of images, how do I like basically synthesize an intermediate viewpoint across these images? It's a similar thing where it's like, I took a bunch of photos of my car, but now I want to synthesize intermediate viewpoints across these images. And I want to do that in a manner that's like as close to the source imagery as possible. So like the glint and veneer of your car, like the glass, the reflection, maybe you have like frickin' explosions and volumetric effects. All of that stuff has sort of been bundled together, in colloquial terms as like light field cameras. Do you remember Lytro a while back? There was this company called Lytro. They were trying to solve this like light field, like this problem of light field where like instead of like explicitly modeling the world with like geometry and things like that, let's like try to model the panoptic function. Let's try to model the light, the light field, if you will, the photons that you're literally seeing from those various viewpoints. And gosh, like that turned out to be like a massive compute problem. You needed like these massive capture rigs. I actually worked on a bunch of this research on things called deep view, where again, you needed like, instead of a massive like multi-million-dollar rig, like circa 2019, we still needed like frickin' like 30, 40, 50 GoPros in an array to go capture these data sets or a large amount of photos. With more of these like deep, and we were using deep learning back then, like this is the early days of using like, reverse gradient descent and things like that. But with NERFs, the real unlock has been, we can do this, like it's not technically a light field, but we can create this like volumetric representation that basically lets the task you ask the AI in very simple terms is like, here's a bag of images again. Instead of figuring out where all the surfaces are and all this other crap we're doing in photogrammetry, like, I just want you to like spitball and eyeball ray tracing. I just want you to imagine you're ray tracing, and I've given you some of these images, and you're doing that, and you're calculating the stuff out, and it creates this volumetric representation that's like, modeling the input images like by the weights of this like multi-layer perceptron. To cut through all like the terminology, basically you're spitballing and eyeballing ray tracing, and you're creating this like volumetric representation where as you change the camera view, the color value and opacity associated with every voxel, like in this like three-dimensional space, changes. And so this is wild. Now you've got this like model, like this like trained model that is representing like a bag of images that you gave it. And the cool part is like, you don't need that many images. It's getting cheaper and cheaper to train. And that lets you do some amazing, amazing things, such as modeling the complexity of reality. Again, all these startup founders are trying to figure out where the monetary use cases for them. Is it visual effects? Well, the VFX industry is sort of in a spiral. There's only a handful of customers for it. Is it real estate? Well, they've already got things like Matterport. Is it Matterport plus plus? But essentially, this like light field-esque technology is far more commodity. And based on where things are going, these like sort of like models that you're giving it images to create representations, they're starting to have babies with these diffusion AI models that we've been talking about. And so like that is going to be amazing, because one of the downsides of NERF, the plus side of a NERF is it encapsulates everything about the space, the background context, everything. If you look at some of my NERFs, you can see all the background context. You lose that with photogrammetry. You only really get like, the places where you find, consistent geometric structure that doesn't change. But I mean, like, you still have holes in the data, right? Like if you're trying to map everything in reality, you can't take all the photos. So you need, like, even though NERFs degrade more gracefully than photogrammetry, meaning if photogrammetry goes around, you get these like awkward, blobby, melty things. Like, like if you look at trees in Google Earth, we call them broccoli trees. They just look like these little plops of broccoli. It loses all the detail, and NERF can start modeling that, but you still need something to fill in the holes. And that's where these diffusion models are going to like change the game as well. So that's a little bit about NERF. And it's just like this ML based approach to solve this like age old problem of reality capture. And, like many things, like GANs were hot for a while, and then diffusion models became hot. Now, all the research in the academic world is about diffusion models, and some people are like, yo, maybe GigaGANs. Let's go back to GANs and look at these other techniques. What you're seeing is same thing with NERF. It's like the hot thing. So it's become both an intermediate representation for all the other perception research that's happening, but also, oh my God, like it's just wild. Like it took like just from my standpoint, like earlier last year, you had to play with these, like wrangle these collabs and take all these photos, and it took like 12 hours to train a NERF. And then NVIDIA came out with Instant GP, and you can like freaking train that thing in a minute on your like consumer grade GPU. So just reality capture getting more and more democratized, and NERF is going to be a key player in all of that.
Amazing. All right, so let's jump into AI. So are we headed towards a future where large language models, LLMs, will there be like, I don't know, 4 or 5 of these things, one from like OpenAI, one from Microsoft, one from Amazon, whatever, like, these big tech companies, and they're like the infra, or like the I don't know, the electricity, if you will, that everyone uses and builds things on top of? Or like how will that play out? And are LLMs, is that like kind of this is going to sound silly, but like the max, I don't know the terminology, the max model that we can go to?
If it's going to be some of this like, transformer based LLM, throw a bunch of data at it and you get these emergent properties approach, there's a holy war in AI happening right now, which is like, no, like, yes, these models are in quotes reasoning engines, and some people debate if it's a reasoning engine or not. What we need is our AI systems that have a far more like, hierarchically decomposed knowledge graph of the world. Like, things about the world on a principled basis, and you can build on that rather than sort of like, I don't know, I'm putting this very crudely, but like predicting the next token or the next word, right? And sure, crazy stuff has happened there, right? Like, as you throw novel data sets as these things and do it at massive scale, these systems are approaching general purpose. So I don't know if it's going to be LLMs, like multimodal, some sort of hybrid thing, like who knows? What I do know is that if I think about the path I would like to see, again, like I'm not going to talk about the left and right here. I'm just going to go in the middle and say like AGI is too much power for everyone to wield, in my opinion. I don't trust humans enough. I'll be honest with you. That's like way too much power, dude. Like I do. It needs to be treated like nuclear. The AGI system. I don't think what we have is anywhere approaching AGI, which is most of the debate. Everything goes into like some AI scientists are saying like this is just like a stochastic dumb parrot, and other people are saying we have to be careful and be prepared to like it's a slippery slope to AGI, and we got to be ready to like frickin' bomb data centers if need be to stop the rogue runaway AI. I think like if we do achieve something on the cusp of AGI, assuming that is possible, I think that even if systems that approach it can't be opened up indiscriminately. So what I'd like to say is like, I'm so happy that the weights for image generation models are opened. I think synthetic media is a solvable problem. We'll figure it out. We'll figure out just like the way we figure out zero-day exploits and freaking patching software vulnerabilities. But when it comes to multimodal systems like GPT-4 and that type of system, like every major company has them, Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, all of them, right? Have these systems, and maybe there are other systems that haven't even decloaked. Does the public sector have them? I don't know. I think that's a big debate. I always like to ask like the top AI researchers, and they're always skeptical. They're like, no. The private sector is far ahead, but they work in the private sector. So I don't know. But what I do know is multimodal models should not be open source. I don't think GPT-4 should be open source. That's just like asking for trouble. You know, there are the simplistic examples of it solving a CAPTCHA for you. What does that mean in terms of like abuse at massive scale? But if you got systems that can reason about different modalities such as text, image, video, audio together and can just do things at the edge, I think the abuse potential is just far too high. So where the future I think that's going to happen is you're going to have these massive AGI systems that, think of it like those, like, I haven't even seen the last season of freaking Westworld, but you know, like everyone's got the sci-fi interpretation of the massive like dome that's in some basement somewhere, like, or, you know, 10,000 feet, but you know, like in like a NORAD style facility, impervious from like earthquakes and nuclear strikes. We'll have those systems, and they'll be few and far in between. And then you will have a bunch of like personalized models everywhere. You know, I think even content may turn into something like that. Like right now we're creating output from these models and like as a video, and I put it on Twitter or on YouTube or whatever. What does it mean when the content you engage with is a model in itself? I think like everyone's going to be making models. It's going to be like super democratic and all of that. But these like extremely powerful, like, you know, real like God tier, dare I say, use that God's word. Maybe that's not even in vain, but like these really powerful systems, you know, I think will be few and far in between. It'll be heavily, heavily regulated. And I think that's the only way it can happen, because if you end up in this world where like everyone has access and we'll just figure it out, like even a small amount of bad actors, like, so what is the open source philosophy? When I talk to people who are like open source maximalist, they'll like to say stuff like, well, there's like the vast amount of people are good actors, and all we need is like enough good actors. And since everything's like out in the open, including the weights and the source code, and like, you know, people can like keep the bad actors in check. Yeah, maybe over time, but if like the blast radius of the things, the harm that you can do is like immense, like, do you really want to unleash that fallout on the world? Like the example I'd like to give is like people are talking about fake reviews. Yeah, maybe the big tech companies can go hire like an offshore team in like Hyderabad or like Philippines and like start hammering through the stuff and like, you know, training discriminators. What are small to medium companies going to do? Like, we're just going to like, that's almost going to be even more in favor of this like centralized dystopia that open source maximalists would like to avoid. So where I think AI is going is some really powerful models that are centralized. And I don't think it's all going to be OpenAI. Maybe it will. I don't know. Like, but I think people underestimate the value of unique data sets, which a lot of these larger tech players and, you know, public sector entities do have access to. Like, on the other hand, you'll have a plurality, a blooming ecosystem of personalized models, some really big ones and a bunch of really small ones that work at the edge. So that's the future I kind of see. And that's a lot like the world we have today. You know, it kind of ends up falling into that, at least in our timeline, falling into that configuration.
So on the AI safety debate, your thought process is, hey, let's have these companies that are creating these really powerful LLMs, quasi AGIs, whatever you want to call them, have those be heavily regulated. How can you? So for something like nuclear, that is a physical. Anything that's physical, it's much easier in my mind to regulate because it's like, hey, like you cannot import uranium or whatever, right? It's like it's like easier for them to control that. For something like software, that and you know this better than everyone, but like software iterates at the pace of iteration there is just absolutely insane. So is it feasible to regulate AI or LLMs or any of this stuff? I just don't know how. I feel like kind of cat's out of the bag, and it's like an arms race, and everyone with a computer has access. It's like, how do you stop that?
I think this is going to be the debate of our time right now. And I think this is the debate that's playing out in the open. Gosh, I don't pretend to have answers here. I can, again, like paint two sides of the same argument, and maybe you and your viewers and listeners can like come to your own conclusions. But I don't think even the smartest minds on the world have figured it out, right? Like, I don't think pausing indefinitely is an answer. Like, let's assume this is the space race, weapons race. And even though nuclear had like, yeah, shit, we can like blow ourselves to smithereens type outcome, I really genuinely think multimodal AI systems, even far before they read anything resembling AGI, are just like, it's like the power of a god, if not God, that can be wielded by somebody to good and bad outcomes. So I think you're right, cat's out of the bag. This is the challenge. Let me set up the challenge first. The challenge is there's a debate whether do you even need more than the public internet, right? Like, so Imad was like, took advantage of like, a crash in GPU prices after the crypto bust started happening and said, hey, researchers, let's just like scrape images off the internet, lie on 5 billion images, 200 to 300 terabytes. Let's distill that down into this like 2 gig, or 2.5 gig or whatever, couple gigabyte checkpoint. Wow, that thing was like a pretty good representation, like was very flexible to create a lot of visual output. Same debate with OpenAI, like, Sam Altman's been quoted saying is like, yeah, like the internet's a lot. Like we can do a lot and then combine that with some specialized data sets, you're good. And then you've got like, companies like Apple with their like sort of walled garden, Google with perhaps a more pseudo open approach. And then, Microsoft and Amazon somewhere in between. They've got their own like metaverses of digital twins about digital activity. And so there's a debate whether you need specialized data or just like open source data. So certainly cat's out of the bag in the sense that like, if you can get compute, which, you can get compute, you can just do it on AWS or heck, like build your own, like, like mining machines. Like people have been building like amazing, like gaming grade hardware weave together to create supercomputers or crap. If you remember the early days of PlayStation, people are weaving PlayStation GPUs together to do that. And just take publicly scraped data, you can start creating some very sophisticated models. So cat's out of the bag there. How do you regulate that? That's the big question, right? All right, so yeah, you could go pontificate, and whether that's like a more like, public-private sector hybrid approach that China takes with regulation, where they're able to keep regulation in lockstep. Like they already issued synthetic media guidelines like 6 or 7 months ago. And like, we're still like, oh yeah, holy crap. Like we can create like Elon Musk almost punching, freaking, insert MMA fighter of your choice, right? Like you can do things like that, or the Trump prison memes that blew up, or the drippy Pope memes, whatever. We're talking about that in a whimsical sense, but we haven't come up with like the policy and institutional framework. So in that sense, maybe there's like benefit to sort of the China model. But the problem there is like the CCP is not going to want these models that can answer questions about Tiananmen Square and things like that, right? So like, how do you figure that out? Like, so you really have to regulate creation of these models on the Western side of the house, like on a more democratic, sort of liberal world. I think it's going to be even harder because we are at a place where scraping the public internet is enough, where you can get compute. That's where you're seeing some of these calls for like, pretty prominent AI researchers saying, hey, we got to start tracking GPUs. Just like the US government puts things on this like ITAR list, right? Like this, like, or this like, this way of like regulating very controlled hardware. And by the way, ITAR, certain types of LiDAR systems like remote sensing capabilities are on that list already. Like obviously the iPhone in our pocket isn't like anywhere near the fidelity where it's worrisome. But like, why was everyone freaking about this China balloon? Like, oh my God, you put a bunch of Earth observation sensors and like, sensors to sample, like just, all the EMF that we're generating, like, and all the communications is happening. You can start building a pretty interesting digital twin of not just the physical world, but the digital, activities that are happening too. So that's worrisome. How do you regulate that? Yeah, I think there's a total dystopian world where the only way to regulate that is like, you gotta have like device level surveillance on your freaking computer. So like nobody can write the runaway AI code that will go off and take over the world. And like, who would implement that type of restriction? It would have to be at an OS level, right? Like certainly you could have the AWSs of the world do that on the cloud side. On the edge, it's going to have to be Apple, Microsoft, and like these big tech players that own the OSs, right? Where development is happening, which is largely on Linux. Hard to control. Holy crap. What do you do then? So I think like this is going to be the debate of a lifetime, and it needs to play out in the next 6 to 12, 24 months so that we have some semblance of like a principled approach to think about how we're going to regulate AI. I do believe it needs to be regulated. I don't think we can leave it totally unregulated. It is like just too powerful. But to wrap things up, I'd say I think different types of AI capabilities need to be regulated differently. I'm not as worried about like content generation models as I am about multimodal models that can reason about all sorts of stuff and then do things at the edge and write disposable code. Like, oh my God, I don't think we've even exhausted the full potential of like, good and bad that you can do with those models.
I see it as pretty futile. Like, there's game theory at play. So all countries are aiming towards getting nuclear weapons in general, like low key. Some of them are more open than others, like North Korea, Iran, etc. But everyone that has nukes feels they're like, okay, cool, I'm good. And so like people probably won't invade me. Hopefully not, right? And and so it's a huge incentive for other people to be like, okay, well, I want a nuke, just as like my ultimate defense. And as I mentioned before, it's way easier to regulate physical goods and uranium and resources, etc. And nuclear scientists, there's not that many, right? Comparative to like software engineers and comparative to computers and GPUs, there's like, I don't know, I'm making this number up, but let's say 1 million times more computer scientists, GPUs and computers than there are nuclear engineers that have the knowledge to somewhat create, these weapons, these nuclear bombs. So my mind, I'm like, man, well, America could regulate it, but then maybe Canada is like, hey, we're not going to, or maybe Luxembourg is like, we're not going, or China, like. So I'm like, okay, I don't see that stopping. I see it accelerating. And, I'm of this, I kind of have come to peace because I'm like, okay, it's going to happen at some point where there's some super intelligence that's created. In my mind, how I rationalize it, this is kind of messed up. But I'm like, okay, well, I'll just pretend that the purpose of people is to create super intelligence. And that's kind of our it's kind of like the sun is eventually going to swallow the earth and the earth is going to, disappear. It's like, well, that's really scary. And it's really bad, and then the Earth is going to be destroyed. But it's like so far in the future, you can't really control it. Who cares? You just go on about your life. I'm like, well, hey, maybe the whole purpose of human evolution and our intelligence is to create a super intelligence that, in essence, or in some way, ends up destroying us. It's like it's not great. It's not not ideal, but like it's kind of unstoppable in my mind. It's like the sun turning into a supernova.
Yeah. I mean, that resonates with me, to be honest. It's like a snowball, right? Like the snowball is happening and there's like momentum, the sheer momentum of whether that's competitive forces or just humans' desire. There's something in us that strives for something greater, like there is something in that. And like every arc of like, like technological revolution, whether that's like, agriculture, or like, like industrialization and now this like digital era where multiple waves are playing out. Now, again, like kind of getting compressed and stacking on top of each other, often in unpredictable ways, right? Like, I think there's no way to stop it, So I'm very favorable to the let's pump the brakes in certain regards wisely approach. I don't have the answers there, but that like intuitively feels like the right thing to do. But you might argue, hey, well, like, what if China reaches AGI 6 months before us? Like, that would be a bad outcome. Like, are you stupid? Like, why would you do that? I think it's a valid and fair argument. So I really hope like the public sector and like the DoD and like just the US government is thinking very deeply about this. Cause like,
you say that, sorry to cut you off. It's funny you say that because we just had like senators in the US government grilling the TikTok CEO, being like, is TikTok connected to Wi-Fi? And the guy's like, yeah, I guess. And he's like, well, this is bad. I'm like, oh God, like we are, like, and me and you were talking about AGI and trying to stop like the Earth from being destroyed, and they're talking about TikTok and Wi-Fi, right? So I'm like, oh man, like it's not good.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to like certainly the politicians in the East seem to be more savvy about the technology itself. 100%. But then again, I think what that senator was trying to ask was like, does TikTok harvest all the connected devices on Wi-Fi? I think that was the intention, maybe by staff, and then it came out as like, oh, like it's like, and obviously this. Yeah, ultimate boomer taking the CEO of TikTok was able to, by the way, hats off to the dude for just enduring that onslaught and not losing his shit, man. Like I don't want that job. Like that's a hard job, but it's and it sounds like, it's going to continue to be a hard one. I have faith there, man. Like I don't think the technology landscape, this is one unpopular opinion I've noticed even throughout my career, is like, I think a lot of us in tech have lost track of the fact that tech wouldn't have existed if not for the defense establishment. A lot of the technologies were created, like all the IoT stuff was made in the Vietnam War. A lot of like early research into computing, the internet, ARPANET, all of that stuff. We've almost like wipe that slate clean, and we're sort of like, oh, it's just all like, rainbows and sunshine. And then it's like we have rude awakenings like the Cambridge Analytica incident and, TikTok algorithms, like, influencing trends for kids to do stupid things and at scale, intentionally, unintentionally, I don't know, jury's out on that. But we sort of lost track of that. I think with AI, we kind of need to go back to that place where technology companies actually play a principal role in things like defense. And luckily, a lot of that has become more in vogue. Like, I don't know if you invest in defense tech, but like, crap, I think about like, Palmer Luckey, everyone was just shitting on the kid left, right, and center, maybe for some good reasons, maybe for some for bad reasons. It was funny for me to see him back on. I don't know if like you're a fan of the All In podcast where they had him on. I'll never forget.
Jason out like right away.
Oh my God. I was just like, I grabbed a whole bag of popcorn for that one because it's like, that was amazing. That was absolutely phenomenal. And it was like right before they did the fireside chat. So I love that. But all this to say, I think because of the, war in Ukraine, a lot of people are being like, oh yeah, like, holy crap, this isn't like some, conservative Republican and, Democratic debate about how we police the borders and like how we issue visas and all this other crap, which by the way, I empathize with. I'm an immigrant, God bless America, all that stuff. And I'm all for legal immigration. At the same time, like now suddenly it's finally cool and trendy to be like, yeah, maybe we should be investing in sensors at the edge. Maybe we should be investing in drone technology that allowed like, Ukraine to essentially hold back an invasion from a pretty massive conventional army, right? So I think in a similar fashion, even if it's not about, again, like atoms, to your point about like drones, like physical harm can be done. You could attach things to them. They could be, doing sensing and doing signals intelligence. You don't want to democratize all that technology. I think all of that is true. But at the same time, I think my message to tech people out there and like even just like people in AI is like, we have to think about like the public and private applications now. And we have to think about them in tandem, because if we don't, and we're utopia out there being hippies, like smoking some weed and singing Kumbaya, there are going to be a small number of bad actors that aren't nation states that are going to wield this technology for immense bad. And we need to put the safeguards in place to make that stuff happen, or at least influence the public conversation. I think there's so many influencers out there like you that need to be getting this message out there so that it becomes, for the next generation, cool to think about these things. And hopefully we have some bright mind that figures out how to like, deal with this like constant stacking of capabilities. We're digitizing ourselves more. These machines mirror us back, the good, bad, and ugly. Because if we don't, like, I think this is the decline of the West. I truly think so. It'll just get subsumed into sort of like, like the a dystopia beyond Orwell's wildest imaginations. I think that could happen unknowingly and unwittingly, even for things that are very innocuous, like carbon credit systems, right? Like that's essentially, you need a global surveillance system to make that stuff viable. And like, if we're talking about, holy crap, you can write an AGI in, let's say, 5 years on a laptop with some compute as training gets cheaper, I think we're going to see a push towards surveillance on every device. And by the way, we already see instantiations of that. One example, if I may close with this, is let's take Apple's walled garden. I actually think Apple is really well set up to police something like this. I don't know what's going to happen with Linux. Microsoft, too, is well set up for this. Everyone's like, well, Apple is like privacy centric. Like, I mean, I give Apple all my data. I'm like, so like iMessage and blah, blah, blah. At the same time, they like announced a capability a little while back where it's like, yeah, we're just going to automatically like run ML, like, you know, perception algorithms and detectors on your imagery in your cloud storage and identify child pornography. All right. Really good. You know, all for it. Let's make that happen. But you're basically running perception tech on your private imagery, and that's just one thing you're looking for. What happens in the future? So I think in this type of walled garden where everything is vertically integrated, I think maybe you could police people not writing the runaway AGI code. Maybe Apple will choose to have very strong terms and service about that and things you can and can't do. They've certainly taken compared to, let's say, the Android Play Store, they've taken a far more like pumping the brakes approach to, you know, what kind of apps are allowed on there, what kind of content is allowed. But they've been able to do that. They've been able to pump the brakes because they own the walled garden. God knows what's going to happen in this frickin' like Linux, you know, buy GPUs and just like do everything off the grid world. It could get bad, but certainly we need to be thinking about it and not putting our head in the sand. That would be the message that I would close on there.
All right, so I want to do some predictions because you know, predictions are always very fun. All right, so AI predictions we'll do 1 year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. And, you know, just to throw out some ideas to get some, you know, conversation started. What are you thinking in terms of like, yeah, 1, 3, 5, like will people be, you know, dating AIs? Like will people have relationships with AIs, or, you know, will there be full movies like box office hits that are completely AI generated, right? So I'm thinking about more fun, weird topics versus like doom.
Yeah, let's bring this back to positivity.
Yeah.
Although I don't know, I mean, like, yeah, people dating their dream waifu sounds kind of dystopian a little bit to me.
It does sound dystopian, but also like if that's your thing, then you know it's your thing.
More
right?
power to you, right? Yeah, totally. I think it could have a greatly positive impact on mental health. Like an AI system that knows you better than you know yourself. Again, here I think like systems like walled gardens like Apple are going to have such an advantage. God, I hope WWDC. Here's my prediction. I hope WWDC happens. They've got these beefy M2 class chips. I hope Apple.
Sorry, WWDC?
Worldwide Developer Conference. Apple's developer conference happens this summer. And I hope they like show that you can run these like crazy, like you can run something like Stable Diffusion at 30 frames per second on like their new M series chips, which are like amazingly powerful. Like the fact that you can run an LLM on like a frickin' $3,000 like laptop that you use in like in a coffee shop versus like a $15,000 GPU, let alone the machine you need to build to use that is wild. So I think like, I hope they have that. I hope they launch some sort of crazy Siri 2.0. And I hope every company does this that's hyper personalized. And then they also offer developer capabilities, just like Google's opening up Palm, OpenAI's opening up frickin', you know, a GPT-4. Yeah, just like these, like not the model itself, but like APIs to build around these models. I think we'll see some amazing things. I think talking to your personalized like AI assistant or characters that play different roles and know everything about you is here to stay. I think I would argue people are already dating like AIs on things like character.ai. If you look at the session links there, they're like far beyond anything else. And that makes sense, right? Like this thing knows you better than you know yourself. I think also things like the mental health crisis, particularly like that's plaguing like younger generations, like millennials and Gen Z. Like, and a lot of us have aversions to go talk to therapists and all this other crap. Like, I think we'll be very content with talking to machines. And these machines will be exceedingly good at reflecting back our introspections. And you know how people say podcasts, when you edit them, they're sort of an introspection. I've only edited a couple of mine. But like that sort of self-reflection can be now assistive with these machines. So I think a lot of good stuff will happen there. I think we're going to see the rise of a whole new type of creator. In the near term, it'll be assisted creation taken to the next level. A studio like will be able to take things to like Marvel Cinematic Universe. An independent creator would suddenly be able to do things that a studio itself could do. Like you need 15, 20 people to do this. No, I just need a couple of AI models, chain them together in my classical here and now workflow. No new tools. Things will be wild. And then, oh my God, what is Marvel going to do with this stuff, right? Like the treasure trove of like visual umami that like some of these like massive IP universes have, like, does that empower a marketing manager to create contextual content on social media at the edge without needing to pay like millions of dollars to ILM and like Digital Domain and all these VFX houses? Probably. But does it create entirely new forms of content consumption? That I think will be the next step. So supercharged content creation in the near term, far more intuitive computing where you can interface with technology. It can reflect our thoughts back to us and help us reason about things we like and dislike, and maybe even solve like loneliness and mental health and all these other problems that plague us. But then in the mid to long term, I'm excited to see how this like reinvents consumption altogether. Like what are games like, right? Like in the early days of Web3, there were so many people that like got inspired by like what was that game called? Freaking like all these massive procedural worlds. Like I think it was like
Diablo, RuneScape.
I'm sure. Like let's take those as examples. I'm trying to remember where games. It's like, hey, there are infinite worlds that you can explore. No Man's Land.
Oh, okay. No Man's Sky.
No Man's Sky. There we go. Yeah, games like No Man's Sky that sort of were these like rules-based approaches to create this procedural world. I think finally now that'll be possible, right? Like to go back to the theme about generative AI populating the metaverse. Gosh, instead of it being like this DLC pack that like everyone gets frustrated for paying another frickin' $29.99 for reskinning Call of Duty or reskinning like, frickin' Fortnite, I think we'll see some really interesting ways in which people reinvent what it means to play with a game, and how do you have like seasonal arcs in those games using generative AI. Beyond that, all bets are off. I don't know. So that's how I think about it. In the near term, it'll like help us accelerate content creation for existing mediums. In the midterm, it'll sort of supercharge these like early stage, new consumption mediums we've had. So interactive games on one hand, and certainly interactive, like choose your own adventure type stuff that like folks like Netflix have played with Bandersnatch. That'll get supercharged. But in the long term, I don't know. It like kind of goes back to, is it going to be like all AI influencers? Hopefully humans are still at the center of it all. And we'll see some really, really interesting things emerge.
So which industry in your mind will be the most impacted by AI the soonest? And, like software development, you have Copilot, you have, I think it's Ghostwriter with Replit. So you have some pretty incredible tools there. Obviously, media entertainment industry, you have tons of incredible content generation tools. Which specific industry in your mind is going to be impacted the soonest?
Look, I think it's going to be literally any industry that falls under the bucket of knowledge work. Anything that relies on manipulating bits for the most part, and certainly involves chaining together multiple tools to do stuff. And that can be anything from like, the McKinseys, the BCGs, and the Deloittes of the world on like the consulting end, to the agency folks, to software development itself, right? Like we talked about, what are the next app unicorns look like when you can just conjure up ops. You can just conjure up applications with a prompt. Hey, make me an app that does this. In the world of disposable content and software, I think almost every industry that deals with digital tools and involves chaining them together to offer products and services are going to be absolutely disrupted and upended. Which one's going to have like the greatest monetary upside, I think, is a little bit hard to predict. I think even OpenAI doesn't know what's going to happen there. It feels like this like, again, early era of like, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's like the analogy that feels the best to me is we're at the like, we've got the smartphones now, let's say. And then we've got the Play stores and the app stores now. we don't know what the Uber is going to be. We're in this sort of like fart app trolloping stage where like certainly a lot of fun. A lot of people are building and playing things. Entirely new businesses will be conjured. At the same time, existing businesses will just like be completely democratized, and capabilities that were sort of like reserved for very specialist few will go to the very, very many. So that's kind of how I think about it, is like, where are opportunities to take things that were very boutique, high-end, human capital intensive endeavors, like software engineering, even like software development. And what does that mean when you democratize that? But then there's second and third order implications of that happening. Those are very hard to predict. So I think of it of that in one way where I'm putting most of my attention, where I'm most excited about, where I think I have a unique viewpoint, is in visual media. Undoubtedly, I'm excited about what visual media does. I think in one case in point I'll make there is like, you see a lot of backlash about AI art generation, Andrew. Like everyone's like, oh my God, AI art, this is like soulless thing. You're like, my IP. You barely see that on the text end, right? Like, and my thesis on why that is like, I think Web 2 democratized text. There were blogs. People don't care if they're like Reddit threads got indexed into this thing. But there's been this barrier to create visual content. And it's been this broken model where you've got these VFX industries that are like simultaneously having like, you know, winning Oscars, and like, you know, it's like just like the people that these artists, the things that these artists have to endure. Like it's been this like downward spiral that hasn't stopped. I don't think AI is going to help that. I think it's going to hasten that spiral. But I think from it, now that everything's democratized, back to an indie can rival the output of a studio can start doing Marvel type things, and then Marvel caliber, you know, cinematic universes can just set a new standard altogether. I think we'll see some very exciting things. And so that's where I'm certainly going to put my energy, and I think I have a unique perspective to bring to the party.
Very cool. All right. Last question before closing questions.
All right.
This is one more prediction. When do we get AGI? I have to ask.
I think it depends on how we define AGI. If you define AGI as everything a human can do, I mean, I give it like 5 to 10 years where it's sort of done all of that. I think the world we will see is like some really massive generalized models, like the trajectory where the multimodal AI movement is sort of going. I think we'll see some very interesting things come out of that. I think to truly have AGI, it needs to do everything a human can do. And I'll just say, like, we'll get to a world where machines can do most of what humans can do in a purely digital world sooner than we get to that in a physical world. That is to say, there's a reason OpenAI pivoted from building robots that could solve Rubik's cubes to, you know, going down this like transformer based, LLM, and, you know, I mean, they're doing other things with diffusion models, whatnot. But this like kind of more, let's solve the problem in the space of bits approach. I think the atoms thing is going to be elusive. I'm kind of happy that's how you get Skynet, you know, to use a cheesy example there, or the potential for it. But yeah, I mean, if I had to guess, I think we'll get to, in quotes, AGI in a purely digital sense, where these systems, whether it's one system to rule them all, which is always the perennial debate, is it one system to rule them all, or is it a federation of models that work in concert? Doesn't matter. I think we'll reach a place where functionally you'll be able to do everything a human could do in a digital sense sooner. And then when it comes to physical sense, that'll come a little bit later. I really can't put a number on it, and I'd hate to do that just because I'll prove myself wrong, Andrew.
So, you know, you did say 5 to 10 years, roughly. So
for solving the bits thing, I don't know about robotics. Like that seems like,
well, so but AGI to me is super intelligence, because once you have AGI, it's a relatively short amount of time before you have super intelligence, in theory.
Yeah, that's one of the Bostrom scenarios, right? You have this sort of like hockey puck moment that follows after that. Have you seen the TV show Person of Interest, by the way?
I've not.
You would love that show. Just if you, based on the questions you've asked me and like this conversation, it was pre-Snowden. It's like it's by Jonathan Nolan, the younger Nolan brother, and it just like has this like, it paints this picture of sort of how an AGI comes online unbeknownst to humanity, and then eventually there are two AGI systems, and one's even getting like, you know, entire governments to work at its behest without them even knowing. So there's this like sort of fast pickup scenario, right? Like where that could totally happen. It reaches parity with us in a digital sense. It like replicates itself everywhere. And like, you know, there's plenty of science fiction about that. And you've certainly got smarter, you know, AI professionals and actual scientists, you know, like
I'm an engineer and a product manager. I don't know anything about like AI research per se. I'm not a researcher. I worked with the researchers, but these smart people, when they start freaking out, I notice. So like, I think you're totally right. That could happen. And that's going to be very unpredictable. I think maybe that's going back to the anxiety. That's why people feel anxiety. I think one of the points have been raised is, hey, if we've got in a petri dish something that's like on the cusp of AGI, why the freak are we putting it in this like public cloud infrastructure for Microsoft Azure? Like that seems like an awful idea. Like, shouldn't it be in this like freaking air gapped, like the ex-VP of product for stability? Chris Cantrell was making this analogy yesterday where he's like, yeah, we need this town that's like, this like nuclear, to go back to the nuclear analogy. We had these like towns back in the day where like a replica of human society where you could do nuclear testing, basically figure out like evacuation scenarios, all of the human factor stuff. And obviously like the hard science that you wanted to do with the impact of nuclear. You could test those things. Shouldn't we have air gap systems where this stuff is happening? So that's one thing. So like, again, like I'm a Libra, and I like always go look at these two extremes. I'm like, yeah, it probably doesn't make sense to put these really powerful models, especially like what we see again as the tip of the iceberg. Sundar just came out and said this with Bard and said that like there are way more powerful systems out there. Like, Sam says this, said this in a recent interview with Lex that like, yeah, we keep having these like, oh crap moments when we like these newer models they're working on, like, holy crap. So it's like, all right, if y'all are freaking out, I hope they're thinking about putting them in like these more air gap systems. Now, whether that's like the machine itself, builds, whether that's like some implicit like emergent property of it learning a survival instinct in quotes, because that's somehow embedded in the distillation of like human knowledge and all the stuff like that it consumes. I don't know about all that, or if it's like some person that just like decides to go crazy and like, let loose these systems with their own intentions. God knows. But yeah, I mean, like to wrap things up, to wrap up the answer, I think like we got to tread carefully. And, since these trends, again, like are stacking on top of each other, the frickin' speed with which stuff is happening is faster and faster. I'm all from breathing from the fire hose. Like I love it. But at the same time, like it would be very naive of us on one hand to think that there is no downside to this. On the other hand, I think it would be very, very naive of us to think that there's only downside and we got to halt progress, because that's how like you create an asymmetric situation in the world. And the only system I think we've seen, to your nuclear example, work out is one where like there's a bunch of powerful, entities out in the world that kind of keep each other in check. And it's not perfect. Crap still happens, but it's the best example we have. So, everything else is like a manifesto, and I haven't seen it work in practice. So those are my 2 cents on this like very difficult and lofty question that I think will keep very bright minds occupied for the time to come.
Totally. All right. We're coming up on 2 hours here. Time for the closing questions.
Let's do it.
What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
The best piece of advice I've ever received is like, be a perpetual optimist and have a relentless desire to learn. And I'll put the current version of that, which is everyone wants to breathe from the fire hose today, but there's a lot of like anxiety. It's exhausting. Certainly I feel exhausted. We have these Twitter spaces every Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern, where like a bunch of creative tech people get together. And we all are just like, oh my God. Like, so the other piece of advice underpinning this to stay curious and keep learning in a sustainable fashion is to take things a week at a time, take things a day at a time, and in times of insane change, which we'll only see more of, take things 1 hour at a time. It's the only way. Just don't go ADD, jump all over the place, one thing at a time, one problem at a time, and on and on and on we go.
Love it. All right. What trait most defines who you are?
I would probably say adaptability. The thing that served me the best in my career, and this relates to learning and curiosity, that's made me adaptable, I guess I would say, is, I've lived in a bunch of different countries, went to international boarding school, had to acclimatize myself to all sorts of like different contexts, cultural, political, freaking, even like different types of like content creation. Like I love all of it. And there are all these niches. So I managed to stay very adaptable. And that's what I love doing. Like, I voracious desire in me to just like, reinvent myself every couple of years. And I've managed to do that. And I'm currently embarking on my next adventure. I think like after doing a decade in tech and like, yeah, let's go be staff level and do all this fun stuff and launch the 0 to 1 products and go do the Google I/O thing and all that stuff. Done that. I think I'm super excited about reinventing myself and kind of creating this like pirate ship with a bunch of other pirates in this like very frothy ocean of innovation that's happening right now. And so I'm excited to do that. And I would say the trait that most defines me and makes me relevant is this dude ain't going to turn into a dinosaur. This dude is going to evolve into whatever the next thing is and just keep going.
That's awesome. All right. Last question. What motivates you?
What motivates me is talking to cool people, working with cool people, and making cool stuff. Honestly, the two themes I started with, I have something in me that makes me want to connect the physical and digital world more inextricably than it, is right now. I think I've certainly made a huge dent in that. Perhaps enough impact for a lifetime. But I think like I'm excited to focus on the other trend that I brought up, which is blending reality and imagination. And the other way to look at that is just democratizing creativity. I'm genuinely excited about like the freaking like 12-year-old me today that has like all these tools at their disposal. Like not just the blenders of the world. Like, gosh, Maya was such a pain in the ass to learn. Like I've got all this bad muscle memory in me and I just can't move to a different tool now. So I just think of like, I want to build tools and experiences that inspire this like next generation of creator that helps them find their voice, whatever it is, but empowers them to turn their mind inside out and put it on whatever canvas of video and 3D today. And then whatever that turns into, whether that's the metaverse and beyond, who knows? But I would love to democratize creativity and let anyone blend reality and imagination.
Incredible. Sir, this was absolutely amazing. I not only feel like I learned just absolutely, college plus level of information here, but also I think that we broached a lot of topics that are very important. And I think a lot of people are going to be talking about in the near future, and a lot of people are talking about now. You were stellar. So if people wanted to find out more about yourself, follow your channels, here's a time to plug whatever you want.
Thank you for having me. This has been a really fun conversation. I'm glad you got some value out of that. I'm really bad at the plugging thing, so let me try my best attempt at it. If people want to follow me, I'm on Twitter, Bilawal Sidhu. I'm on YouTube and TikTok, BillyFX. On YouTube and TikTok, you'll find a bunch of scroll stopping content. It's where I use these tools to make compelling content. If you're interested in understanding the analysis and insights of the intersection of creativity and technology, creative workflows for how you can make stuff like this, definitely check out my Twitter and my Substack. My Substack is Creative Tech Digest. And if you want to get in touch with me, if you're a brand that's interested in doing really cool things at the intersection of creativity and technology, please hit me up. You can find my one link. Just search for BillyFX on Google. You'll find my beacons.ai link, and that has all my contact information at the end. And also, if you are a startup and a established player building creation tools, I'd love to get in touch. I'm already talking to most of them. But if you're out there and you're a startup that has a desire to create something that all these creation incumbents aren't thinking about, I'd love to get in touch. I want to get involved in just a handful of advisory roles. So as I focus on being a content creator full-time and doing the brand thing, creating original content, I would love to still engage my product management shops and be of help to empower this next generation of creator. I don't want to build a startup myself. It feels like the most chaotic time to go build a startup. And it seems like it's easy to raise money now too. But if you've raised money and you want a high impact advisor, hit me up as well. Same thing, BillyFX, beacons.ai. If you just Google BillyFX or Bilawal Sidhu, that's BilawalSidhu. You can find me, get in touch, and we'll make magic together.
Amazing. Sir, thank you so much.
Andrew, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
See you.